Good afternoon to everyone who joined us today, and we will have more joining as we move forward with our exceptional event. I'm Anna Tavis, the chair of the Human Capital Management Programs here at NYU, and I will be hosting a lineup, an extraordinary lineup of speakers for this upcoming 2025-2026 academic year series of Rethinking work. Today, I am particularly honored to have our inaugural speaker for this year, this academic year, Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who actually lectured at NYU when he was living in New York just a few years ago. I am absolutely delighted that he's going to be talking about his 12th book. And as always, he lived to his name recognition as the most provocative and, to me, most authentic thinker that we have now in the world of work, people analytics, technology, and the transformation of the workplace. So Dr. Chamorro grew up in the neighborhood of Buenos Aires, literally called Villa Freud, and wrote his PhD thesis on narcissism. It's like he's been preparing for this moment in our collective history for before the arrival of Instagram to really question one of the most cherished self-help mantras that we hear today. And that is about how we need to be authentic. So to unpack this fantastic new book, Don't Be Yourself, Why Authenticity is Overrated and What to Do About It, I am inviting Dr. Chamorro to join us all the way from Rome. And so please walk us through what your thoughts are on this very, very urgent topic of narcissism in our lives. Thank you, Tomas, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you everybody also for joining us today. Yeah, as you heard, I have a history with NYU, teaching not just in New York, but mostly actually in London. NYU, of course, I think the premier global university, so many campuses, including in my native Buenos Aires. I know, Anna, you're headed there soon. But also, let me also tell our esteemed audience that Anna is a very special person for me, a great friend who always has been a great mentor as well and given me very important advice. Not including to be myself, but actually to make smart choices in my life, which I have appreciated. And so with that, let me start with the most inauthentic slide that I have for you today, because even though I am from Argentina and I am biologically and sort of like from a nurture perspective Argentine, I'm actually at least trying to be somewhat humble. So it's very embarrassing for me to flaunt and pimp my books. But my publisher is begging for pre-orders to increase. I know Elizabeth and the NYU team have posted also on the chat function the URL to the book. If you want to pre-order it, not necessarily because you're already of the opinion that we need to have a more rational and data-driven, more nuanced take on authenticity, but perhaps even because you believe in the authenticity cult and want to challenge yourself, please put in the pre-order, and I hope you enjoy the book. A little bit just of background on myself and some of the previous books, because I often get described as a polemical or controversial thinker, and I know that some of my ideas have been controversial, but I am at heart a scientist practitioner, an IO psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist, who really tries to decrease the gap between science and practice, something that so many of my great colleagues in this amazing but still underrated discipline try to do. And I think that's probably the common thread to many of my books. If I go back to the previous books, about 12, 13 years ago, I wrote my first sort of like trade book or book for the general public coming out of, full-time academia, where I questioned the notion that, confidence is always good, and the more you have it, the better off you are, which seemed quite heretic at the time in the US. But of course, the point I'm trying to make is that we are mostly or generally better pursuing self-knowledge and self-awareness than astronomical levels of self-belief, which, as Anna alluded already, can often be conflated with narcissistic entitlement. A few years later, I wrote a book that a lot of HR professionals have read, The Talent Illusion, where I questioned the notion that we're actually any good at evaluating talent and especially potential, not just in others, but also in ourselves. And I made the case for why data, not intuition, is a much better vehicle for making people decisions at work. This was before the current wave of, or the recent wave of analytics, and now the current wave of AI. And the next book, sort of asked a question that was simultaneously heretic or controversial, but a lot of people said, well, finally, somebody is asking this question. I tried to explain why there is this gap between the leaders we need and the leaders we actually get. And again, made the case for evidence and data and assessment, and even AI as an antidote to making intuitive decisions that end up being like indigestion in the long term, not just in politics, but also in kind of the corporate world. And the last book, the one before this one, if you're interested in AI, actually talked about the potential negative effects that artificial intelligence may have on human behavior at the individual and the societal level. AI is amazing. I'm a huge believer. I use it at the individual level. I use it with my teams. I use it for work. But, as I argued in the book, there's a lot of evidence that it can also unlock or unleash our worst tendencies, making us more impulsive, less creative, less curious. And that's something that I try to kind of warn and also, warn against and find a solution. So I think there was a great article last year on zombie leadership and ideas that, even though they have been discredited by science and evidence, are still popular. I quote in my last book on authenticity, one of my favorite Oscar Wilde quotes that says, everything popular is wrong. Or as Mark Twain said, if you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to question your views and your opinions, right? So authenticity is no different than for some of these other ideas. It's an idea that might feel good and certainly has popular appeal and acclaim. But what I always try to do, the topics that keep me up at night and sort of warrant doing yet another book, even though whenever I finish one, I swear to myself I will never do another one, are topics that have become not just very popular, but where the popular view has become so irrational that a commonsensical antidote is controversial. And so with that, let's talk about authenticity. In a nutshell, I think, there's several problems to this notion. The first is that, if you really think about it from a behavioral, scientific, empirical, or even philosophical kind of a standpoint, whatever you do is part of you. So even if you try not to be yourself, you're always going to be you. You cannot be anybody else. Jarvis Cocker, the lead singer of Pulp, put it in a much better way. You will always be stuck with you wherever you go and whatever you do. So, like if we're serious about it, it's not a concept that makes logical sense. A second problem that really is at the heart of what I describe and sort of illustrate in my book is that authenticity is actually very hard to measure. You have these two approaches, the so-called kind of self-report approach, which talks about state authenticity or whether you feel authentic. And as we know from decades of psychological research and social psychological research, is like we bullshit ourselves all the time. The story we tell ourselves about who we are and our identity is like sugar-coated and is designed to inflate our self-esteem. It doesn't really overlap very much with how other people see us or think of us. So your private self and your public self, your identity and your reputation overlap only marginally. The other better approach to quantifying or measuring authenticity is peer reviews, peer ratings, or other reports. And they are more significant. But again, you know, even if 100 people rate you and find you authentic, there's no indication that you are. And actually, most of the research shows that people who are seen as authentic by others engage in very skilled strategic impression management and self-presentation. Besides, as I will show, you know, we find authentic people who have high status, people who are attractive, people who are charismatic, and people who actually espouse or display our values. And we find inauthentic those who don't. So, you know, it's a little bit like sort of like not exiting our echo chamber or belief system. A third problem is that really, if you think about it, be yourself is not authentic advice. This is the main kind of advice that we see throughout the self-help literature and industry, also increasingly in modern HR or corporate cultures. But if people are telling you to just be you, to bring your whole self to work, and then what's rewarded is something else, playing the game of politics, sucking up to your boss, and engaging in successful or effective impression management and faking it, then it's insincere and irresponsible to actually persuade people to just be themselves and to not worry about what others think of them. And the final one is that it follows that actually, you know, if we are, for example, encouraging young people to just be themselves when they go to a job interview, or junior employees to not worry about others think of them when they're interacting with their bosses or clients and high stake kind of, stakeholders, actually all the evidence indicates that that is more likely to harm than advance your career. True story I tell in the book. You know, I have a great colleague that works for me and worked for me for a few years. Lovely guy, very well liked. But one day he turned out to my office for career advice wearing this T-shirt. You know, he was wearing it out of like pride and thinking that this was a very kind of a sort of like moral approach to conducting yourself in the workplace. But I couldn't stop myself. I mean, if you think about it, you know, there are basically two possibilities, if you like the notion of wearing this T-shirt. Either you're the only person who wears this T-shirt and the whole world should evolve around you and adjust to you, which basically means you're kind of very egocentric and egotistical and a narcissist, or you think everybody should wear this T-shirt and therefore we're living in an anarchic society where nobody makes an effort to adjust to anybody else. So either way, it doesn't work. A book that I recommend, other than my own, is this recent book by a Danish anthropologist called Infantilize. It starts with a similar or related story of a young person who is having their performance review. The manager says to this person, young employee, hey, you know, you've been great, you hit your targets, you've been really, really performing very well. A little bit of constructive feedback or opportunities to develop, if you like. It will be good if you pay more attention to how you spell things, because your spelling is a bit sloppy. And the employee says, what do you mean? You know, why is it sloppy? For example, what? Well, you know, when you're spelling these words, especially communicating to clients or external people, pay attention to your spelling and your grammar. And the employee's answer is, but that's how I spell it. Then this person goes home, complains to the parents call the manager and say, how dare you tell my daughter how she should spell? That's how she spells it, right? And, you know, you don't have to use your imagination, you know, to go too far, to stretch it. Like, if we optimize the world just for everybody's individual fantasies or egotistical kind of cravings, is not very scalable. I don't know if we have a lot of movie or series fans here in our audience, but season 5 of Fargo is fantastic. And there is a seminal interaction between Jennifer Lee and John Hamm, where, I take this quote from, which is in my book as well. The only people in the world, she says to him, who demand absolute freedom without any responsibility are babies. It should not be applied, or it should not be an aspiration by emotionally mature or adjusted adults. So a little bit on the cult of authenticity, which it's important to acknowledge is not equally distributed around the world. I just came back from a work trip in Asia, and if you go to places like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, I mean, generally Confucian collectivistic societies, they will tell you, what is this all about? I mean, we are under enormous pressure to conform to a majority, to follow hierarchies, and, we would love to have some of this American freedom or West Coast aspirational freedom of just be ourselves. But if you are in most industrialized democracies, especially Western democracies, the authenticity cult has taken authenticity to an extreme. Of course, as said, most self-help publications, business, management, articles, podcasts really, really push people or nudge people to just be themselves. Of course, if you travel around the world, I've come to the conclusion, actually, people are a lot like restaurants. When they tell you they're authentic, they're probably as authentic as when you see authentic Thai food or authentic Italian food or authentic Sichuanese food or, authentic Mexican food. You can safely assume they're probably not. Just like if people actually tell you that you can just be yourself at work, if you really need to tell somebody, it probably means they're not free to behave in the way they want without that message being kind of imposed or inculcated on them. In the consumer industry or kind of retail, especially at the luxury end of the spectrum, authenticity is everywhere. I mean, I don't know if you're interested in, for example, one of the most kind of high-end areas of the luxury industry, the diamond industry. It is impossible today to know whether a diamond is synthetic or natural, lab-grown or natural, even with the best equipment in the world. But people will still pay 10, 20, 30, 50 times more if it has a certificate of authenticity. Likewise, political elections are generally won or lost on the basis of the perceived or attributed authenticity of candidates, even if we are not accurately assessing how authentic people and leaders are. And if we make these decisions after snap kind of ratings or just spending, 5, 30 or 45 seconds watching a presidential debate, televised presidential debate. So most famously, in the run-up to the 2016 election, one of the reasons why voters allegedly, decided to choose Trump and not Hillary is because she wasn't authentic. She was robotic and not trustworthy, whereas he was authentic. Actually, there's a lot of research also showing more widely on the so-called a-hole factor of leadership authenticity. When leaders engage in contrarian, anti-establishment, sort of like rebellious, and quite frankly, often rude behavior, it's a strategy to be seen as more authentic by voters and others. So that's interesting, right? So behaving in an antisocial rather than prosocial way makes you seem more authentic. And of course, more recently, as said, I wrote my latest, previous to this one, book on this. AI has given authenticity a whole new connotation. We're now in a state where most of the, human content is indistinguishable or hard to distinguish from AI or synthetic machine-generated content. There's in fact almost no way to know, which actually is forcing us to even fake authenticity or seem more authentic than we would naturally be. So there is already studies and research showing that if you swear a lot or put in typos in your content, even if it has been generated by ChatGPT, others would think, okay, this has been done by a human, right? So imperfection is the trait that makes content seem more human, and AI is catching up with that and faking mistakes as well. Of course, we all had to endure and have to endure on a regular basis this tedious cyber security checks where we have to prove to machine that we're not a robot. right? I don't know about you, but personally, I failed this test multiple times. So I'm beginning to question my own humanity, and I'm no longer sure whether I am a human or not. And a couple of years ago, authenticity was actually chosen as the word of the year. This is when I had already started writing my book on the basis that it cuts through all these narratives, whether we're talking about brands, consumerism, politicians, and AI versus human content. We crave authentic stuff. In fact, it might be that very shortly, for example, if you're a coach or a consultant or an average knowledge worker, what you do will be indistinguishable from machine content or AI production. But if people think that it was done by a human, they might pay a little bit more for it. Same, by the way, for music. You know, if you think it has been generated by the real Taylor Swift as opposed to AI Taylor Swift, you're going to pay more money for it and go to her concert. And along the same lines, of course, in marketing and the world of kind of consumer behavior and studies, we know that the experience economy has sort of like tried to push people to have more authentic or real experiences. This recent ad by Louis Vuitton kind of sums it up, right? Okay, so but what does authenticity actually mean? And what do we mean by authenticity? Since subjectivity and individualism are at the heart of authenticity, why don't you use the chat or the Q&A function to tell me what you think authenticity is, what it means to you. And then we can see at the end, when we kind of break to the fireside chat or the Q&A with Anna, what some of these responses are. So please write what your definition would be. Hopefully you can multitask so you can still pay attention to the presentation. In the book, I argue that there are 4 common traps that actually describe or illustrate the popular or mainstream view of authenticity. And these are kind of not just definitions, but they're also hacks or nudges, or, in a way, they are attempts to kind of guide people to behave in certain ways. So there's a sense of kind of morality that underpins the popular notion of authenticity. The first is this idea that you should always be truthful or honest, not just with others, but also with yourself, which is a nice idea, right? But as mentioned already, decades of psychological research show not only that we bullshit ourselves all the time about who we are, and like, to give a simple example, if you ask people whether they're a nice person, almost 100% of people would say yes, including some of the most toxic people in the world. And not because they're lying to you, they're actually lying to themselves. And there are advantages of seeing yourself in a positive vein. In fact, the term for people who have the capacity to see themselves in a more accurate way is called depressive realism, which goes to show that actually self-delusions or self-deceptions, positive, optimistic self-enhancement, actually is very adaptational. For example, if you go into a job interview thinking that you're amazing, you're more likely to get that interview than if you go there and seem to be capable of expressing your self-doubt, which is, of course, what rational humans would do. Equally, even companies, corporate cultures like, Ray Dalio's Bridgewater, to name a famous one, that champion radical candor or transparency, would admit that there are limits to, indulging in honesty. So if you go to Ray Dalio's TED Talk, he would tell you, well, we try to call it as it is. And despite, even if you're talking to your boss, you should criticize them and tell them what you think, because rational, constructive dissent is key to making better decisions and innovating. But he would tell you, if somebody turns up after maternity or paternity leave and shows you a picture of their newborn baby and said, oh, don't you think my baby is cute? You're not going to say, no, they look like, they look horrible. So there are limits, and those limits are set by pro-social etiquette, which has actually made it possible for us to work together and collaborate together. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, the dominant working or operating model that worked really, really well, not just to enable collaboration with others, particularly people who aren't like us, but also to drive cultures of tolerance and civility in the workplace, was to pretend to agree with your boss and smile to them and then bitch about them when you get home. And that is still, the way forward. Of course, that doesn't mean that, there aren't any examples of leaders or powerful people indulging in the privilege that they have to be unfiltered or be authentic or behave without consideration to what other people think. But the fact that they can do it doesn't make them good role models. And just one example here, but there are so many other examples. A second trap or second kind of angle or dimension of authenticity is this notion that you should behave without any consideration or concern for what others think and think of you, which, by the way, is impossible, right? Unless you are kind of totally on the spectrum or you were raised by wolves, you are always going to be influenced by others. To be sure, if we tell people that they should not worry about what other people tell them, we're still telling them what to do. So, even if you try to not conform to someone or something or a rule, you're still conforming, usually by doing the opposite. And of course, even if we are not in the presence of others, we are impacted by our morality, which comes from having interacted with other people, at least if you are a mature, adjusted, and normal human being. So your moral values that tell you what's right and what's wrong are, come from economic socialization and are inculcated by you by early upbringing, your significant others, caregivers, parents, grandparents, aunts, friends, and so on. So, rather than thinking, for example, as Brené Brown famously put it, that authenticity is the daily practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are, I would say that, in fact, maturity requires you to understand where the right to be you ends and your obligation to others begins. This is a fundamental, kind of hallmark of maturity. Philosophical roots to this notion that we should not engage in exacerbated impression management or do as we are told because it's an act of bad faith come, of course, from French existentialism and romanticism and humanist philosophy. At some time during humanism, we decided that all other sources of meaning are meaningless. We stopped believing in God. We stopped paying attention to religion, community, society, and all meaning came from us, which is where individualism starts. And of course, Jean-Paul Sartre, drinking his Bordeaux wine in Le Deux Magots and smoking his Gauloise cigarettes while being an iconic member of the French bourgeoisie, he would be sort of the more modern equivalent of a hipster in Williamsburg today, said, don't worry about what other people think of you, just be you, right? Which is, of course, quite ironic. A third trap is this notion that we should always follow our hearts and be true to our values no matter what. It relates to the second one. And of course, it sounds great, but, let me tell you at the outset that, some of the best examples of people who were actually true to their values no matter what and didn't care about other people's values were actually some of the most destructive and toxic leaders in history. Take some of the people illustrated here. I mean, there is no question that they told us how they think. They told us what their values are, and they had, no inhibition, and, they exhibited a great level of alignment between their thoughts and their behaviors, which we think is great, but it depends. It depends what those values are. I think if you're a pro-social person who is an ethical and moral human being, by all means, be true to your values. But if your values are toxic, destructive, psychopathic, or antisocial, please, 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 please fake it and make an effort to adjust to the norms of society. Otherwise, we're all in trouble. Michael Morris at Columbia University has a great book, recent book, also illustrating on a much less extreme version that we are very, very tribalized and polarized today. Mostly because we're so egocentric and focused on our own values. We seem to have lost the ability to question our values and be open to other people's values, to the point that even environments or cultures that pretend to care about inclusivity and diversity, or perhaps they do, find it very hard to have people at different ends of the political spectrum to work with each other. And another great book that I recommend by Paul Bloom at Yale University has this controversial title, Against Empathy, but the point he makes is really, really important and data-driven. We evolved empathy, our brain evolved empathy as a mechanism to prioritize our next of kin, people who are like us, right? So for most of our evolutionary history and our human history, we lived with small groups in hunter-gatherer societies, and the capacity for empathy helped us protect people who were part of our clan. Fast forward to 2025, or 1950, if you like, and we're trying to collaborate and work with people who have very little in common with us. And what Paul Bloom says is that we can't rely on empathy for us to be kind and tolerant and nice to those people. We have to engage in rational compassion. In other words, inauthentic kindness, because it doesn't come from the heart or the mind, but it comes from actually being a good organizational or social citizen. And finally, this notion that you should bring your whole self to work. I mean, ideally, I shouldn't need to kind of refute this, but because it's at the heart of like now the modern psychological contract, and it has turned, as Anna will know, into almost like a perk. Come here and you can just be you and, behave in whatever way they want. Well, if we think about it, this rule doesn't really apply to everybody. The invitation to just be you only applies to you if you actually share the values of the majority. So can I bring my whole self to work if I'm a fascist? Probably not. Hopefully not. If I'm a sexist? Hopefully not. If I'm a racist? Hopefully not. But if you continue with that list, at some point you will be left with, the values of the majority. And therefore, we realize that actually if the invitation to bring your whole self only applies to those people who are fully aligned with their culture, perhaps because the culture is so strong that it resembles a cult, there's a lot of negativity in that kind of formula or hack. By the way, your whole self also includes your dark side. Grumpy you, impulsive you, narrow-minded you, opinionated you. If we invite people to bring their whole self, we have to put up with them sharing or broadcasting their unsolicited views about the world with others, making inappropriate jokes of or about their colleagues with others, and so on. And by the way, although bring your whole self to work has at times been used as a diversity and inclusion, equity and belonging kind of formula, in reality, it mistakenly assumes that the majority of employees are interested in sharing their private or personal self with their work colleagues. For most people, work has always been and will always be work, something you do to make ends meet, and because you have to. And by the way, most, if not all employers are not interested in who you really are deep down. They're interested in seeing the best version of you, which requires you to suppress and filter and inhibit your negative or counterproductive tendencies. Psychology students will also be aware of this wonderful concept of self-complexity. In essence, we all inhabit multiple selves. Our identity is not one-dimensional. Again, unless you're part of a cult and that kind of sort of like organization or institution has completely subsumed or collapsed all aspects of yourself. For the majority of people, identity comprises not just the professional self, but also their private selves, their hobbies, tango, yoga, Pilates, philosophy, and community, family, religion. And, it's unrealistic to expect work to actually cater to all of these dimensions of ourselves. In fact, if we think that work must and should cater to every single aspect of our identity, we're bound to be disappointed. 100 years ago, when a typical worker returned home from the assembly line, they would not complain to their spouse that today they didn't find a higher sense of calling or a sense of purpose, so they must quit. So we have to be realistic about what work can deliver. A couple more things before we open it up for the Q&A. But as noted, the most important aspect of authenticity is not the internal or subjective one, but the external one. We always get hired, fired, promoted, or demoted, not based on what you think of ourselves, what we think of ourselves, but what others think of us. So what matters is your reputation. And people who have a reputation for being trustworthy, sincere, and good colleagues or good bosses or good employees actually engage in skilled or successful self-presentation. The father of sociology, Erving Goffman, wrote about this 5 or 6 decades ago. He said there are only 2 forms of self-presentation, which, by the way, both imply acting. What he called surface acting, which is tedious emotional labor, and when people are clearly making a big effort to fake it and they don't believe in it. The waiter or waitress who's telling you, hi, I'm Tomas, I'm here to help, but you see them suffering because it's painful for them to put on this fake artificial repertoire, and you tell them, just relax, you can be yourself because it's uncomfortable. And the other form, which is deep acting, where you actually believe the professional role or the work role or the presentation you put forward. So the best salespeople don't need to lie to clients because they have lied to themselves already about the product being amazing and so on. The best politicians, the best actors, they are almost like method actors. They are in character and can identify with their professional self. William Kahn, who coined the term employee engagement, actually included this approach in his definition of engagement. He said, employee engagement is the degree to which you identify with your work persona. So people who are highly engaged see their professional self as a core part of their identity. Therefore, they are deep actors, not surface actors. And so if we try to apply this to, famous leaders, and, it's tempting to say, oh, is Obama authentic? Is Trump authentic? I've written about both. But the real answer is we just don't know. Even if we asked Michelle and Melania whether at home they are the same person, they seem to be in professional settings, or we try to scrutinize whether there's consistency between their thoughts and their action, there isn't an objective way to know if they're acting in authentic ways. Maybe it's going to be Neuralink. Maybe Elon Musk needs to implant AI in our brain to see, but even our brains won't tell us that because we are subject of our own delusions. What we know is that if people find Obama authentic, they probably identify with his values, and if people find Trump authentic, they probably identify his. So it's back to tribalism. I want to talk about EQ because the majority of people who love authenticity also love emotional intelligence. But by most rigorous definitions, emotional intelligence is almost the reverse of authenticity. People who are the emblems of high EQ can manage themselves, they can exercise self-control, they're in control of their emotions, they are phlegmatic, cool-headed, and they are very effective at not just making the right impression on others, but also understanding how other people see them. And people who have low EQ basically are very authentic in the sense that they impose their unfiltered, uninhibited, and uncensored self on others. Some of them can still be successful. Most of them do so because they are successful already. And we have to understand that we spend a lot of time asking out-group and low-status individuals to just be themselves, but actually authenticity is a perk or a privilege for the elite, for the status quo. We're better off if we actually persuaded those who are in power to make an effort to not be themselves or to be less of their unfiltered, uninhibited selves. A great meta-analysis on this, if you look at the best measures of emotional intelligence and the best measures of personality, you can see that both emotional intelligence and the underlying meta trait that underpins the big 5 personality trait can be interpreted as impression management. Okay, so again, if you're a great poker player, if you're in control of yourself, you can empathize. If you're not egocentric or self-centric and you can understand how other people feel, you have high EQ, you will score highly on personality measures, and you're probably not authentic. And a few high-stakes situations require you to behave authentically. By the way, if you're about to go to a job interview, even if you hear that you should just be yourself, please, 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 please don't. The interview is not an invitation to present your uncensored, uninhibited, and unedited self on others. It's an invitation to show that you are capable of displaying social skills and that you're aware of the etiquette. So if, for example, they ask you what your worst weaknesses are, please don't tell people what they actually are. Tell them something about your, unavoidable perfectionism, or that you're too humble, to kind of show off, and some other BS that actually works wonders. And effective leadership, just to finish on leadership, actually requires the ability to be inauthentic. Jeffrey Pfeffer has written about this extensively in a great book called Leadership BS. I love Erminia Ibarra's work on this. My work is really just a footnote to her pioneering work on this. And she talks about how even feeling like a fake can be a sign of growth. Because if you put yourself in situations that are unnatural for you, that are outside your comfort zone because you can't navigate them in default, you might actually be growing. You might actually be learning a new repertoire or range of adaptation that actually helps you evolve as a leader. And of course, leaders need to be able to understand what others think and spend more time focusing on listening than on speaking, and on what others need than what they need themselves. I even think if we have people here who are coaches, executive coaches, or interested in coaching, as I know you are, Anna, that actually to a large degree, the evolution of leaders and of people involves learning how to go against their nature. Learning to not become a more exaggerated version of themselves, but to actually make certain behaviors that are learned adaptations part of their reputation. And with that, I just want to finish with two of my favorite quotes on the subject. The first is by the novelist Kurt Vonnegut, who said, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be." Just because it's advantageous and convenient or adaptive to make an effort to basically make a good impression and manage impressions and engage in sociable desirable behavior doesn't mean you can do so randomly. Cultivating your reputation is about choosing the behaviors that are closer to your ideal self than your actual or past self. So in other words, why would you limit yourself by your, or why would you let your past and present self limit yourself if you can actually sculpt your future self and expand who you are? And then one of my favorite documentary makers and filmmakers, the great Werner Herzog, who said, "A house that is completely," unfortunately, I can't do his accent, but it's much better in his accent. "A house that is completely lit up is not livable. Likewise, if you're trying to illuminate every single part of you to the world, you're really not really worth living with." So choose wisely. And with that, I'm going to open it up for the Q&A. Thank you very much. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you. I think this was, as promised, very provocative. I think lots of questions, and I want you to respond in the first place when we asked our audience to submit the definition of authenticity. It was, predictably, the majority is true to your values, being able to stand up to, being transparent, speak your mind, exactly the kind of characteristics that you describe as not particularly productive in the social setting, right?
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going through them, and yes, very aligned with the 4 traps, which is good. I like some of them, that go a little bit further. So for example, Michael Kaushansky says, "Speak from the heart," which is also a good one, right? But it does sounds great. And I think there are times in life, maybe relationships rather than work, in which we have to let the heart drive our decisions. But of course, as Kahneman and Tversky showed, most of our decisions are intuitive. They're coming from the heart. And that also explains a lot of negative behavior, prejudice, discrimination, narrow-minded, the mental shortcuts that we engage in on an average or typical day actually constrain the rationality and the success of our decisions as well. Sometimes being able to question our heart is as important or even more important.
And I think we created a kind of an escape latch there with the bias. That's the whole what you described. You could be authentic, but you could be self-aware and know your biases. And we do the training for biases, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, we're purifying our humanity by kind of purging out the biases that have been imposed on us, et cetera. Where does bias sit?
Well, even that is a great kind of sort of like dimension of that, Anna, because and I think unconscious bias interventions have had mixed results. I mean, I've been sort of like a critic of a lot of these approaches, but nonetheless, I do like the kind of behavioral economist approach of we need to sort of make an effort to think slow, because if we think fast, we will definitely fall victim of our biases. By the way, thinking fast also has advantages, right? If every time you get on a plane because you're flying, making a trip on vacation or for work, you have to say, okay, I can't be sure whether the pilot can be trusted. So I'm going to go and check on them and have a chat and see, life would be impossible if we have to stop. We have to make assumptions. But at the same time, there are times in which questioning our assumptions and slowing down and thinking slowly is the only antidote to behaving in a biased way, spontaneously, authentically, which is how you behave when you are with your best friends, close friends, because they have probably learned to love your real self, or at least put up with it for, a few days, maybe not the whole vacation. I think in professional settings, we have to have the ability to sort of like pause, reflect, and engage in metacognitive behavior that says, oh, my gut feel was to not trust this person, but actually, why? Or to trust this person, but actually, they're just like me.
Yeah, there are a couple of really good and practical questions. Bob Pulver is asking you, what are the implications for HR? On you could take both sides, the person who is interviewing for a job and the person who is the interviewer for looking, they all agree that they're looking for an authentic professional, but they're coming to it from the different perspectives. What are the recommendations?
So, the answer to all of these questions is, let's start with making an effort to appreciate nuance and rational moderation. I almost think my next book should be on radical moderation, because everything is so extreme, right? So of course I spend a lot of time critiquing mindless authenticity or the authenticity cult, but we need to understand also that there is a risk to overdoing impression management. If you go to a job interview as a candidate and say, oh, you're so amazing, I love you, working here a bit, and you're clearly overdoing it, you will pay a price. And there is a risk to doing that, which is like, okay, this person is a politician or is like clearly bullshitting me, right? At the same time, if you go there and like make no effort to engage in some degree of impression management, you're probably going to be, overlooked for that job. I mean, if we like examples such as, Trump, Musk, even Steve Jobs, many of whom might be geniuses or might have been geniuses, let's remember that they got fired from their own companies more than once, and they were dispositionally unemployable. A lot of successful entrepreneurs are more authentic, and they didn't want to put up with, corporate crap or politics, so they went it. They were, but that's like the 0.1% that make it, right? For everybody else, I think some basic etiquette is important. On the advice for HR professionals, I think first, maybe if they care about authenticity, they should find a more authentic proposition to employees. Like, for example, saying, look, our priority is to build a culture that is inclusive, that rewards civil behavior, tolerance to others, kindness. The great philosopher Karl Popper has a quote that I use in my book which I love, right? Because in the context of like freedom of speech crusaders and like, insult anybody because Popper said, you can't have tolerance or a tolerant society unless you learn to be intolerant to intolerance. Same if we think about psychological safety, right? Amy Edmondson's work. It's not to create the conditions where people can just engage in rude behavior and offend others. It's to create the condition where people understand that they are safe to speak up while respecting others and while respecting the collective rules and norms that govern organizational life and cooperation. So I think, HR professionals and leaders in general should focus more on rewarding and sanctioning behaviors and less about what people really think deep down, not least because if you're trying to get people to work together when they don't agree on everything, their core beliefs, and you want to have a mature workforce, not an infantile kind of workplace or a cult, you need to explain to them that, there are certain things that don't belong to work and that, certain aspects of their whole self are better left at home. In fact, and I always say my whole self isn't even welcomed at home. I mean, there are parts that, the people who live with me at home said, can you please take them out and not bring them back? Maybe not to work, but somewhere else.
Really excellent. And by the way, we only have time for maybe one question, but I do recommend that we all look at the book. I had the privilege of previewing it for Harvard Business Publishing. So there's a lot more nuance in the book that will be able to, answer some of the questions that come up. There's one question here from Chantel Wilson here, and she's saying, what are the practical ways to stop rewarding confidence over competence? I mean, that is a real issue. And because we do see confidence as a competence oftentimes. And I know that this theme runs through all of your books, Tomas.
Yes, it does. And it's a great question, Chantel. I'm also like very happy to see so many familiar names in the Q&A. Look, Chantel, I think that it might sound counterintuitive, but I think really the only way to do this is to minimize or de-emphasize the importance of intuitive human judgments. If we stick to the interview, or it could be a first client presentation or meeting, the minute you have humans in the room, they're going to want to make decisions based on the first 30, 60 seconds. And unfortunately, if the person they're judging or evaluating seems confident, particularly if they're a white middle-aged male or middle-aged white male, which rings close to home, of course, they're going to conflate the two. And as I have shown in a lot of my previous work, the correlation between confidence and competence is 0.3, which indicates only a 9% overlap, right? So, of course, if we create or we develop expertise and competence, it takes true competence and expertise to spot competence and incompetence, then we're going to be less guided by whether people think they're good at something, especially when they are in fact not. And AI gets a lot of shtick and criticism and backlash for when it goes wrong and when it amplifies human biases. But the reality is that artificial intelligence is not just good at learning, it's also good at unlearning. There is a way to program AI or data-driven tools to focus on true signals of potential, of talents, of leadership competence, while actually ignoring things like race, class, gender, socioeconomic status, nationality, attractiveness. Even if AI develops a lot, it will never be biased in a human way. Algorithms will never be as pathetic as humans. They will never develop the capacity to have a fragile self-esteem, which they need to big up by bringing other people down, or maybe other AI down. You know, maybe this is like Grok trying to insult ChatGPT and Gemini because it needs to boost its self-esteem. I realize suddenly I'm saying something that is actually more feasible than I thought initially. But there you go. This might be a good ending.
Yeah, no, it's excellent. And again, there's a whole range of responses. And what I love about it, Tomas, it's and what is very authentic is some people really can't resonate with what you're saying because there's been a lot of investment in the whole industry of authenticity. And all I want to say is I am so happy that you're bringing this up. You're bringing this to the NYU audience. I think this is what the universities are all about, not taking things for granted. And we will continue to explore. And I am sure that you're going to get some feedback coming through your LinkedIn account. And if you have your contact information and how people can get
Yes.
in touch, please let us know.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy, Anna. So it's hello@drtomas.com, and that's DRTOMAS.com. And here's the book. This is my copy, as you can see. I really love it, but I might be biased, so don't trust my judgment. More importantly, Anna was indeed one of the early reviewers who said, yeah, you can publish this. And so I'm grateful for that as well, Anna.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone here for participating. It is the beginning of the academic year. Everyone is busy, but I think we got off on a very, very strong start for this series. Thank you very much. We will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.